If you're sensitive to violence, abuse, or bodily manipulation, stop reading now. This account is not for the faint of hearted. It's not for the curious or the thrill seekers who romanticize horror and human depravity from a safe distance. My intent is to not entertain, but to document, as objectively as I can, an encounter with one of the most chilling minds I've ever studied. Nathaniel Barnes, better known as the Taker. Barnes is not a killer. He's never taken a life, at least not directly, yet his crimes have left trails of irreplaceable damage that ripples across lives, families, and communities. He is America's most infamous serial mutilator, a man whose philosophy is as twisted as the scars that are etched onto his disfigured body. Barnes doesn't see himself as a monster. He sees himself as a force of change, a catalyst for human potential, no matter whether that potential is done for the good or for the bad. This is an account of my brief but unforgettable time with him. Understand that there will be graphic depictions of past violence. This is your last warning. Before you continue reading this interview, it's important that you understand the nature of Nathaniel Barnes' actions. What follows are the case files of 3 of his confirmed victims. These accounts are presented clinically, without embellishment. Please be aware that the details are disturbing, but I need you to comprehend the gravity of what Barnes has done to fully understand the twisted nature of his philosophy. Case File 1. Mark Saunders. Age 31. Occupation accountant. Abducted 16 days, 384 hours. Location Sacramento, California. Mutilations: severely dislocated both knees and elbows, partially removal of left ear, left eye is surgically removed and replaced with a foreign object. Condition upon release: Mark was found crawling in a disoriented state, unable to recognize his surroundings. Case File 2. Fiona Martin. Age 25. Occupation software developer. Abducted 18 days, 432 hours. Location Chicago, Illinois. Mutilations: removal of all fingertips from both hands, several toes removed from both feet. A section of skin from her right cheek to her right temple was excised. Several deep lacerations on the scalp. Condition upon release: Fiona was found disoriented, unable to speak coherently. Case File 3. Kevin Russo. Age 38. Occupation construction foreman. Abducted 14 days, 336 hours. Location Denver, Colorado. Mutilations: both hands severed at the wrist, teeth removed from the upper jaw, left leg amputated just above the knee. Condition upon release: Kevin was found in a manic state. He exhibited intense fear of any repetitive actions. The meeting. My name is Emily Greaves. I'm a doctoral candidate in criminal psychology at Warren University. And 3 months ago, I was granted the rare opportunity to interview one of America's most infamous criminals, Nathaniel Barnes. You know him as the Taker. The interview room where I met with Nathaniel Barnes was as oppressive as you would expect concrete gray walls. A metal table bolted to the floor, and a series of flickering tube lights overhead. It felt uncomfortably clinical. The metallic scent of industrial-grade disinfectant overpowered the room. Even so, I took in a deep breath of that air. I prepared for this interview meticulously, rehearsing questions, reviewing case files, and reminding myself to remain cool, calm, and collected. But no amount of preparation could have readied me for Barnes's arrival. When he walked in with the guards, the first thing I noticed about him was his stride. Barnes was broken. His own body had been his first and longest running victim. His joints had stopped willingly cooperating with him years ago, yet he moved his body deliberately despite them. Each of his steps was slow and measured, as though he was consciously aware of every movement his muscles made. Even with his hands cuffed in front of him, he maintained some level of control. I quickly noticed that his face hadn't fared any better than his body. It was made up of a roadmap of self-induced scar tissue, among which lay a deep, jagged line that ran from the corner of his left eye to his mouth, permanently twisting his expression into a perpetual half sneer. But what disturbed me most about his face was his eyes. They were a pale, translucent blue, so light it almost felt like his dark pupils were the only inhabitants of them, and those pupils happened to be unflinchingly focused on me. They were disconcertingly steady. The guards seated him on a metal stool across from me, and for a moment the room was silent, except for the clanking of his cuffs being repositioned onto the table surface. I glanced over towards his hands. They were disfigured. Both of his fingers and knuckles were gnarled and misshapen form in what I could only assume to have been repeated fractures. I decided to wait for the guards to leave the room before beginning our interview. In that time, Barnes didn't speak. He didn't even acknowledge the guards as they left. He simply stared at me, his head tilted slightly to one side. I cleared my throat as I allowed my fingers to slip open my notebook. Mr. Barnes, thank you for meeting with me. I readied my pen. That's when I noticed it was trembling slightly in my hand. Barnes didn't respond immediately. He took his time. I watched as he straightened himself out, the chains around his wrist rattling as they chattered against the table. There was a moment. I don't know if he would ever speak, but that moment, the thought had crossed my mind, was the moment he began talking. His voice came out painfully raspy, yet completely deliberate, each word enunciated with care. You're nervous, he said. It was a statement of fact. I adjusted my posture, forcing myself to meet his eyes with mine. Yes, I replied, keeping my tone as neutral as I could. I think it's a natural reaction when a person sits across from someone like you. The corner of his mouth twitched. The scar along his lips stretched unnaturally. Someone like me, he repeated, as if tasting the words. Tell me, Miss Greaves, how do you see me? I hesitated. I was aware that any response I gave him would be scrutinized. You're the subject of my study, I said carefully. A man whose actions have impacted countless lives. He tilted his head further, his off-white eyes narrowing. He disapproved. Impacted, he echoed. A safe word. Neutral. Harmless. You're hedging. I stayed quiet, hoping he would elaborate, but he seemed content to let the silence linger. It was in that silence that the ticking of the wall clock became unbearably loud to my ears. Do you know the first thing I noticed about you? He asked, his low rumbling voice shattering the quiet. I shook my head, gripping my pen tighter, forcing my hand still. What's that? You walk as if you're afraid of stirring the pot, he said, his voice calm. Every step, deliberate, but hesitant, careful not to disrupt. It's fascinating, really. Is that so? I forced a small, professional smile, refusing to give him the reaction he was clearly seeking. He nodded slowly. Fascinating, because it's a lie. Every step stirs the pot, Miss Greaves, whether you see it or not. I took a breath, steadying myself. You've left quite a few steps yourself, Mr. Barnes, irreversible ones. His expression remained consistent, but there was a glint in his eyes, something cold and amused. Irreversible, he said, leaning forward slightly. Another safe word. Sterile. But tell me, when you think of my steps, do you picture the footprints being left in the flesh or in the mind? The mind, I admitted, my voice softer than I intended. His smile then, a slow, deliberate smile. Good, he said simply. At least you're honest. There was another pause, one that felt intentional, calculated. He tapped a scarred finger against the table, the faint sound unnervingly rhythmic. Do you know what separates me from you? He asked. I resisted the urge to shake my head, forcing myself to remain composed. Why don't you tell me? He leaned back again, his gaze unwavering. I don't waste words, he said, and I don't waste time hedging the center of anything. The words lingered in the air, heavy and final. I didn't respond, unsure how to even proceed. He seemed to relish my hesitation, watching me with the same unsettling intensity as he had when he first walked in. Shall we continue? He asked softly, as if the last few moments had been nothing more than pleasantries and introductions. I took a moment to refocus, turning the page in my notebook to avoid looking directly into his eyes. Barnes's presence demanded focus in a way I hadn't anticipated. Every word, every glance felt intentional, as though each moment held a weight I wasn't prepared to bear. Regardless, I decided to push forward. Mr. Barnes, I began, keeping my voice steady, I'd like to discuss your philosophy, specifically your belief in the permanence of words and actions. Can you explain that? He regarded me for a long moment, his pale blue eyes unblinking. Explain it, he repeated, as if testing a word. Then he leaned forward, the chain between his cuffs clinking softly. No, but I can show you. I swallowed, but didn't respond, waiting for him to continue. He didn't look at me as he spoke. Instead, his gaze shifted to the table, his scarred fingers bruising its surface. Do you remember your first scar? He asked suddenly. The question caught me off guard. Yes, I said. I scraped my knee when I was 6, fell off of a bike. He nodded, almost imperceptibly. And what did you learn from it? I frowned, unsure how to answer. To be more careful, I suppose. A faint smile tugged at his disfigured mouth. More careful, he echoed. So you wouldn't fall again. Exactly, I replied, trying to keep my tone neutral. He tilted his head. But you did fall again, didn't you? Yes, I admitted cautiously. Everyone does. He tapped the table lightly with his knuckles, the rhythm irregular but deliberate. And yet, every time you learn the same lesson: to be careful, to avoid pain. But pain isn't the enemy, Miss Greaves. Forgetting it is. I stayed silent, allowing him to continue. He paused as if choosing his next words carefully. Pain reminds you that something happened, a moment, a choice, a consequence. But a scar, he said, gesturing towards his own face, ensures you never forget. I scribbled a quick note. You said before that every word and action leaves a mark. Are you suggesting pain is necessary for permanence? His smile widened slightly. Not necessarily, he said, leaning back again, but it's inevitable. The question isn't whether we leave marks, Miss Greaves. It's whether we choose them. I hesitated before speaking. You're saying we should actively seek to leave marks, that we should inflict pain. His expression didn't change, but there was a sharpness in his eyes that made me regret the phrasing. I didn't say that, he replied, Everly, but you assumed it. Why? I faltered, caught off guard by the turn of the conversation. Perhaps because your actions have caused pain. He nodded as if concealing the point. You see, Miss Greaves, he said after a moment, his voice quieter now, about gentle. The world fears permanence. They prefer their words soft, their actions reversible, apologies, edits, second chances. But life doesn't work that way. Every breath, every step is final. The air in the room seemed heavier, his words filling every inch of space. I shifted in my chair, suddenly aware of the sound of my own breathing. And that frightens you, he added, his gaze piercing. The thought that nothing you do can ever be undone. So you ignore it. I didn't answer immediately, unsure if he was seeking a response. When I finally spoke, my voice felt small. Are you saying it shouldn't frighten me? His smile returned, faint but unmistakable. It should empower you. There was a pause, deliberate and unsettling. His fingers stilled, resting flat against the table. But most people, he continued, prefer their cages. They fear the weight of their own potential. Before I could respond, he leaned forward again, his voice dropping to a new whisper. Do you? Barnes' question hung in the air, a challenge wrapped in a guise of curiosity. Do you fear the weight of your own potential? I didn't answer immediately, focusing instead the act of note-taking. I think, I said carefully, most people struggle with the idea of potential because it feels limitless. Limitations give structure. His scarred face shifted into something like an amused grin. Structure, he said, dragging out the word, a soft prison, a gilded leash. He leaned back, the cuffs around his wrist clinking against the table. Do you want to hear a story, Miss Greaves? I nodded, unsure of what else to say. There was a man, Barnes began. his tone calm and deliberate. An ordinary man. He had a job, a fiance, a future. He lived his life the way he was told to live it, predictably, safely. His world made sense because he stayed within his lines. He paused. One night, on a highway, lit only by the moon and the stars, he spoke 3 words to the woman of his dreams. Beside him, 3 little words. Do you want to know what they were? No, I said quietly. He held my gaze unblinkingly. It doesn't matter. He let the words hang, then continued. That was his answer to a question she asked him. I don't remember the question anymore, but those 3 words, they're burned into me. His hands moved as though he were tracing a crevice along the table's edge. A second later, the crash happened. Metal screaming, glass exploding, her blood everywhere. I froze, gripping my pen tighter as he spoke. He wasn't emotional, but the weight of his words was suffocating. When I woke up, she was gone. My body was shattered, but I was still breathing. And do you know what I thought, Miss Greaves? No, I whispered. I thought of those words. It doesn't matter. The last thing she ever heard from me. He leaned forward, his pale eyes fixed on mine, and I realized in that moment I'd lied to her, to myself. Everything matters. Every word, every action, because once it's done, it can't be undone. Barnes exhaled slowly, his breath rattling like a whisper against the silence. Do you know how many people lie to themselves about that every day? I shook my head. Almost everyone, he said simply. But not me. Not anymore. He paused before speaking again, his eyes tracing the edges of the room as though considering his next words carefully. Then he began. Once there was a rabbit, he said, his voice unhurried, each syllable drawn out with unsettling care. A young one. It lived a small, predictable life. Every day it would hop along the same paths, dig in the same burrow, nibble at the same clovers. It was safe, comfortable, because the world was predictable. I felt my skin crawl, but I didn't interrupt. Then, one day, a hunter came. Mars's eyes flickered towards me, watching my reaction. Not to kill it, no. A hunter like no other. He was patient. He wanted to teach the rabbit a lesson. He paused, and I could almost hear the silence stretch around us. This hunter, he knew exactly what he was doing. He waited until the rabbit was deep in the underbrush, where it felt safe, alone, and then he struck. Barnes's hands slowly curled into fists, his wrists strained against the cuffs. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. First, Barnes said, his voice softening, he broke his limbs, not to kill it, just to make it suffer. The bones snapped clean, the flesh torn, but the rabbit didn't die. No, the hunter wanted it to live. He wanted it to feel the agony that he felt to carry that pain with it for the rest of his life. I blinked, the mental image gnawing at me, but Barnes wasn't finished. Then, he continued, he did something to his face. The poor thing couldn't scream, could it? Not with his broken mouth, his skin flapping loosely about, but it still bled. The hunter cut a small line along his throat, just enough to let the blood pour out, just slow enough for it to know it was happening. The rabbit felt that. It felt the blood leaving, but it didn't die. The hunter was good with his knife. The rabbit, Barnes went on, his tone steady, almost philosophical, was returned to the wild, free but changed. Every time he tried to go back to his hole and hesitated, he didn't trust the path anymore. He couldn't. Every time he saw another rabbit hop along the same route, it froze, remembering the hunter's touch. It no longer knew how to return to his routines. Every time it saw something familiar, it became terrified because it knew that nothing would ever be the same again. I tried to study my breathing, but it was impossible. The image he painted was horrific, and I knew it mirrored the fate of one of his victims. The details were too precise, too intimate. Do you know what happened to the rabbit? Barnes asked, his voice suddenly softer. It never found peace again. It wandered, avoiding its odd paths, never returning to the safety of his hole. It grew paranoid, always looking over his shoulder. It knew the smallest of his choices mattered after that, so it hopped off into the woods and died. He looked at me with a steady, unsettling calm. That's what I did for her. I couldn't help but flinch as the weight of the story settled in. I realized he was talking about Sarah Yodowich, her file, her history. A woman had been a regular elementary school teacher, living a life of predictable patterns until Barnes had taken her. It was the mangling of the rabbit's face, the breaking of his jaw, and in the forest that had made it clear to me. Barnes let the silence hang before speaking again, his voice softer now, about as if he were musing to himself. You see, Miss Greaves, I didn't kill her. I didn't need to. I taught her that everything she did mattered, that every routine she followed could lead her right back into the hands of someone like me. Her only option was to think about every decision she could make, and she finally made one where I could never follow her. I swallowed, my mouth dry, and I forced myself to stay composed to write down his words, even though my hands trembled. And she wasn't the only one, Barnes continued, his tone shifting slightly through still, slow, and deliberate. The others, they all learned the same lesson. The accountant, the cashier, the young woman who worked at the diner, they all learned that their routines, their safe little patterns, they could lead them right back into my grasp. And once they understood that, they couldn't unsee it. His eyes glinted, the smallest hint of satisfaction curling his lips. They don't fear death now, Miss Greaves. They fear repetition. They fear being stuck in the same place, doing the same thing, thinking the same thoughts. He leaned forward, his voice quiet, almost intimate. And that is the gift I give them. The gift of awareness. Barnes remained silent for a moment, his icy eyes fixed on me. The weight of his gaze was almost tangible. I had learned by now not to break the silence, to allow him to speak when he was ready, but the tension in the room had thickened to a point where it felt suffocating. Finally, he spoke again. "You're afraid," he said, his voice low and deliberate, each word falling with unnerving precision. "But not of me, not of what I've done." I didn't respond, but the silence in the room seemed to grow heavier as he continued. "You're afraid of realizing how important you could be." I fought to keep my expression neutral. I had done my research. I was prepared for these kinds of manipulations. But his words sank into me deeper than I cared to admit. I couldn't help but feel the creeping uncertainty take root. "Tell me something," Barnes said, his voice even softer now, but no less cutting. "How many decisions have you made in the past month that you really didn't think about? The ones that were automatic. What did you have for breakfast this morning?" I blinked. "Cereal. It's cereal." "Yes," he interrupted, leaning forward slightly. "And how many mornings have you had that exact same breakfast? Same bowl, same spoon, same motion?" I hesitated, unsure where he was going with this. "It doesn't matter," I said, the words coming out more defensively than I intended. "It does matter," he countered, his eyes narrowing slightly. "It matters because it's the very thing I've been showing you all along. You don't see it, but it's there. In every decision you make, you're trapped by the repetition. You're no different from them, from anyone." He was right. I could feel my breath hitching in my chest, the air in the room growing hotter with each word. He wasn't just talking about routines or habits, he was talking about the cage I fastened around my very existence, my self-imposed restrictions. "You came here to study me," Barnes said slowly, "to understand me. But you never asked yourself why. Why you felt so compelled to understand someone like me. Why you're drawn to this darkness." I couldn't respond. He had cornered me in a way I hadn't expected. "And now," he continued, leaning in with a quiet smile, "you'll see what I've been talking about. You'll understand the moment you leave this room. You've woken up." The cold, uncomfortable realization hit me then. He didn't agree to meet with me for an interview. It wasn't even to facilitate the reliving of what he did to his victims. This was about me. I was the next subject, the next target. Barnes sat back, his hands folding calmly in his lap as he watched me struggle with the weight of his words. "You won't go back to the same life," he said, his voice chillingly calm. "You'll feel it. Every routine, every thought will feel like a trap. You'll question every action, every word, until it makes you insane." I didn't answer. I didn't need to. His smile said it all. The following morning, I woke up to the sound of my alarm ringing on the nightstand, exactly as it had every day for the last 6 months. I didn't need to look at the clock to know the time. It was 6:30 a.m., just like yesterday and the day before that, and every day Before that, the same routine. I sat up, rubbing my eyes, and reached for the glass of water on my bedside table. I didn't think about the action, just performed it out of habit. Drink, swallowed, set the glass back down. I ran my fingers through my hair, then grabbed the toothbrush. 2 minutes, I told myself. Standard. As I brushed my teeth, my eyes drifted to the mirror and I realized I'd been staring at my reflection for several seconds. I hadn't even noticed when I had stopped brushing. My routine, the motions, the predictability of it all, was this it? Was this how every day was supposed to unfold? Barnes' voice echoed in my mind. Everything is permanent. Every action and opportunity. But the weight of it, of everything, he said, pressed against me, suffocating. I rinsed my mouth, then went to the kitchen. Cereal, milk, same spoon, same bowl. A repetitive motion, one I didn't even think about until now. I paused mid-sip, the spoon still in my mouth, and stared at the bowl in front of me. How many mornings had I done this without thinking? How many mornings had passed where I didn't even bother to ask if I was alive in any meaningful way? I set the spoon down and reached for the knife. I wasn't sure why, but I needed to feel something real, something that wasn't automatic. The blade sliced through my hand. I didn't expect it to happen, but I felt the sting of the sharp metal cutting into my palm. I flinched, but I didn't pull away. Instead, I let the blade bleed at the edge of my skin, watching it drip, a scar reminder. I realized. I watched the blood for a moment. This is permanent. The scar would stay. It was a sign, a mark that I couldn't undo. My pulse raised as I thought about what Barnes had said, about what he had shown me. Every action matters. I washed my hands, pressing the cut under cold water. The scar would form, it would be there, a permanent reminder. But as I stood there, feeling the throb in my hand, something else started to settle in my mind. Nothing was stopping me from realizing my potential, except for myself. The same monotony I had built around me, the same routines I had fallen into without thinking, they were my own creation. The power was mine to change. The thought was suffocating, liberating, terrifying. What if every decision, every action, every breath matters? What would I do? What could I do? I looked at my reflection again. The scar started to form. I could already feel it, the weight of it. Barnes had made me see it, and now I couldn't ignore it. The routine, the predictability, it wasn't enough. Not anymore. I left the kitchen, my palms still throbbing, but my mind clearer than I had ever been. As I walked out the door. I didn't look back. Every moment mattered, and from that moment on, I was in control.